there's a distinct kind of racism in higher education that I've been calling prescriptive. And what that is when people have a script, basically, a list of characteristics and behaviors and values that they assume all people of a particular group have. And this is the key part to prescriptive racism, if that person does not abide by those rules, that script, there's something wrong with that person. Well, academia is the kind of place where, being a racial minority can be beneficial in some ways, right? You are more recognized because, well, you tend to stand out. Studies show that the fact that an institution has an EDI workshop or talks about cultural competence can go a long way. It shows people that the institution cares. And if the institution cares, then there's a chance that they can find some sense of belonging. Evolve, I would say devolve. And I would say that because of what I said earlier about the definition of race, and your quoting of Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech. We've regressed from that.
Eric, thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of our research about racism in higher education. Could I just ask you to start by introducing yourself and giving us some insights into some of the amazing work that you do?
Okay, well, I'm Erec Smith. I am many things. Associate Professor of Rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania. I am a research fellow at the Cato Institute. Specifically in politics and society. I am a co-founder and president of Free Black Thought, which is an organization that showcases viewpoint diversity within the Black diaspora and gives voices to those who aren't really represented in the mainstream media.
Cool. How would you define racism if someone was to ask you what it was?
That's interesting because definitions of racism abound, apparently, and I always thought it meant discrimination based on race. But nowadays people say it's discrimination plus power. So, and black people are considered as not having power. There's all kinds of things I take issue with in that. But let's just say I don't abide by the second definition. I abide by the first one, which means that black people, Asian people, Native American, what have you, can be racist too, right? Whereas other people don't see it that way.
In your opinion, what are some common examples of racism in higher education, and how does racism manifest itself in higher education?
Well, racism manifests itself in higher education the way it manifests itself in a lot of different areas. You'll have students who have never met a person of color before until they went to college. So there's bound to be some, tension there, in some way. You have professors who expect students of color to be a certain way. They either expect them to not write in standard English, or I don't know, whatever people expect black people to do, That's the case. But there's a distinct kind of racism in higher education that I've been calling prescriptive. And what that is when people have a script, basically, a list of characteristics and behaviors and values that they assume all people of a particular group have. And this is the key part to prescriptive racism, if that person does not abide by those rules, that script, there's something wrong with that person, right? So I've had this happen, actually, a few times in the last few years. A white person taking offense to a degree with the fact that I speak in what can be called standard English, right? I'm supposed to speak in African American vernacular English. To them, my speaking in standard English is a kind of cultural appropriation, right? So there's that aspect of racism too that not enough people are talking about, in my opinion.
So what would you say your views or opinions are on institution, systemic, or structural racism?
Well, first of all, I'll say this. I think it exists, but it's overstated. What I mean by that is, yes, you have things like, high school curricula where American history is a requirement, but African American history is an elective. You have rules in those schools that say you can't wear dreadlocks. And they'll say, well, that goes for white kids too, but it's mostly an African descent thing. So it's there in those senses, and people can find various policies here and there in an institution that inadvertently affect people of color in detrimental ways. But there are a lot of people who see or define structural racism as racism that is systemic throughout a culture, a society. Every institution, is inherently racist. Some say because the policies were made during a racist time. Not that, racism is gone now, but, otherwise intelligent people will tell you, well, that was written in the 1800s. There was slavery in the 1800s. Therefore, that document is racist. That kind of logic makes no sense to me. But that is said. So again, I know it's there. It's there in some ways, but I think it's overstated.
Can you share some of your experiences of racism in higher education, and how have these experiences potentially affected you personally and professionally?
Okay. Well, instances of racism in higher education, mostly from other students when I was a student.
Okay.
And, that's to be expected to some extent, sadly. But when it comes to faculty and staff, things like that, I can't really think of anything off the top of my head. Unless you're talking about prescriptive racism. That I have several examples of, right? For example, before I got into, this culture war thing, I was interested in Buddhist philosophy and its confluence with rhetorical theory, right? But I wasn't being distinctly black about it, right? I wasn't doing black Buddhist philosophy or black rhetorical theory, right? And because of that, you're seen as kind of invisible, right? So not just students, but definitely colleagues, will look at me and say, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? There was one colleague I had at an institution I will not name who, and this is something that occurred to me after a while, after giving him the benefit of the doubt and things like that. I'm not supposed to be teaching Plato and Aristotle, right? I'm supposed to be doing the black stuff. He teaches Plato and Aristotle, right? So that kind of thing I've seen much more than your run-of-the-mill racism.
Have you ever felt that your race or ethnicity has affected your opportunities for advancement or recognition in your field?
Well, academia is the kind of place where, being a racial minority can be beneficial in some ways, right? You are more recognized because, well, you tend to stand out a little bit. What's more, people want to be seen as open-minded, so, a professor, they're jumping at the chance to work on your master's thesis or your dissertation or something like that, right? regarding negative, again, I don't have very many memories or even any memories of that happening outright. Yeah.
Okay. In your opinion, what can universities and colleges do to create a more inclusive and equitable environment for staff and students of color?
Well, I'll start with students, rather. I'll start with students. I think outreach programs, more of those need to happen. They are working, they exist, but I don't think enough schools are doing it. Partnerships between colleges and high schools, if not, primary schools, in which professors visit the students where they are, and the students come on campus, right, to see what it means to be a college student, right, what it means to be this major or that major. I think a lot of the issues with student retention, especially among minorities, a lot of the issue is culture shock, right? You're not used to the environment. You're not used to what's going on. A lot of things are new to you and therefore scary to some degree. I think an outreach program that is sufficiently immersive can go a long way in doing that. We have bridge programs, which typically happen the summer before first year, right? That's too late. I think it should happen in high school at least, right? Maybe middle school, maybe elementary school, but definitely high school. Regarding staff, I guess a lot of cultural competence can be a good thing. So I'm not against workshops on EDI or anything like that. I'm against workshops of a particular ideology regarding EDI. But I think cultural competence can go a long way, and a workshop, can do that. Now, that workshop has to make sure that it's not essentializing based on race. So the line should be, here is something that a particular culture does. This does not mean that's an individual who is perceived to be from that culture acts this way or embraces these values or beliefs or anything like that. So yeah, that's about it.
Just in terms of some of the outreach programs and potentially other initiatives that you just mentioned, who does the responsibility lie on in terms of potentially bringing them forward or at least suggesting them for them to be done? Would you say it's the higher ups, vice chancellors, whoever they may be, or would you say it's those who are aware that there's an inclusivity issue here and that needs to be resolved? Like who does the buck stop at, would you say?
Ideally, all of the above.
Yeah.
I think college administration and high school administration who recognize this issue with inclusivity should work together and start doing things at least in high school, right? I don't think it's purely the onus of the college or university to reach out to the high school, and I don't think vice versa either. I think somebody should initiate it, but I don't care who does it first, right? As long as somebody does it.
Okay. How do you think higher education can improve their efforts to recruit or retain more diverse staff and students?
Well, outreach programs, cultural competence, right? And studies show that the fact that an institution has an EDI workshop or talks about cultural competence can go a long way. It shows people that the institution cares. And if the institution cares, then there's a chance that they could find some sense of belonging, inclusivity here, right? So again, just the outreach, the cultural competence, and making that as visual as possible. And making sure that everybody has access to resources that can benefit them.
Cool. In terms of representation, I can speak for myself. Being a mature student at this university, The promo video for the course that I actually embarked on is what actually sold me on, returning to do this course. I saw a black man who was actually the head of the course I was enrolling on. In terms of, employing, a diverse group of staff, would you say that the staff in question should really care about tokenism, or whether or not it's a case of institutions have quotas to fulfill, hence why they're going to bring more staff in, or it doesn't matter because they're employing a diverse group of people and there are more there's more reward on the other side of that, as opposed to being too concerned about how they're inviting more staff of color through the door?
I'm not a big fan of quota systems for several reasons. One of them being the many people of color who told me, I don't know why they hired me. Is it because of my, my skills? Is it because of my knowledge, which is good, or is it because I'm black and they needed a black person? Right. And that kind of nagging question in the back of your head, it can take its toll. Right. What's more, I think that without quota systems, we have to figure out other ways of doing things, which is, in my opinion, more beneficial. So those outreach programs and things like that, for example, right? I also think that instead of quota systems, we should dedicate ourselves to doing merit correctly, right? And have some rules in place, some parameters, a rubric for hiring that can better ensure that merit is truly being looked at and not somebody's relation to the boss or something like that, right? So that's what I would say.
Okay. In Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by their character." Does this statement at all resonate with your views around EMC? And if so, please elaborate.
Yes, it does. I believe wholeheartedly in that statement. And the problem with the ideologies that are undergirding a lot of EDI initiatives today is that they see that statement as wildly naive. They think you should judge somebody based on their skin color, which is to make assumptions about that person because nobody is psychic. I don't think so, right? And that is its own kind of racism, in my opinion. The prescriptive variety, perhaps, that I talked about earlier. I think behavior, I think skill, expertise, merit, right? Those are the things that we should use to, interpret somebody's actions or understand somebody, or get to know somebody, or things like that. Otherwise, you're projecting an identity on the people. To see race in the way a lot of people are suggesting is to see only race, right? Or to see race first, second, and third, and then maybe fourth. This person is an individual, right? And I don't think that is the way to go. I think that's going backwards, as a matter of fact.
Okay. What support or resources have been available to you as a staff member or of color, in higher education? And in your opinion, is it adequate?
Well, I have resources that everybody else has, right? Funding for conferences, time off to write a book. I've had all these things. I'm fortunate to have tenure. So I don't think I've been deprived of anything. There was one institution where I didn't think I was being heard enough. My voice wasn't taken seriously, perhaps because of the prescriptive racism, or because my field wasn't something that they were used to. Rhetoric and composition is relatively new. Although it's not new, relative to the other disciplines, it is. So when a rhetorician is surrounded by people doing lit, that rhetorician is always already kind of an outsider. So combine that with possible racism, and you got an unideal situation, right? So I have felt like I wasn't being heard or taken seriously, but that was one institution, and it didn't last very long.
Yeah. For those who potentially are still in the position that you were in during that time, what are some of the actions that they could potentially take to be heard within the, just the parameters of just, not going overboard, if we can put it that way. Someone who potentially has been in that position where they're trying to make their case known, but they're not being heard. What are the alternative measures that you potentially put forward to someone in that position?
Well, unfortunately, sometimes the best thing to do is find another institution. But if you're not going to do that, then have your required work on faculty senate, for example, be based on your interest. Have articles published be based on your interest, especially if you're tenure track and they have to read this and see that it's being taken seriously by a flagship journal in your field, right? And again, keep speaking up. Sometimes perhaps you can break through that barrier, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go someplace else where you don't have to do all that to be heard, right? My first thing would be to leave, go someplace where you are heard, and tell everybody about the institution you're at. Tell everybody.
How have you seen the conversation around race and racism and EDI in higher education evolve over time?
Evolve, I would say devolve. And I would say that because of what I said earlier about the definition of race, and your quoting of Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech. We've regressed from that. I think it's devolved into you are your race, your membership in a racial group, and that's it. Or that's primary, and secondarily, you can be an individual. And I mean, people are writing these things in their publications. That group affiliation is more important, and they're downplaying individuality or demonizing it. And if you look at the infographic on white ways of knowing or aspects of whiteness, right, and what it implies about what it is to be authentically black, then I'd say we devolved into something that I thought we were trying to get away from.
I was in conversation recently with a prominent journalist. Actually, I want to say the president of the Sports Journalists Association in the UK, who's a black journalist by the name of Darren Lewis. And we were talking about the issue of minority, or the term minority. I'm personally noticing a lot more people of color taking exception to being labeled as a minority. They would rather we use other terms. Would you say that term almost feeds into what you've just mentioned there about it, the issue or the topic of racism devolving over time? Labels like minority, are you someone that you kind of you take issue to that as a term, or would you say not really, and it's more a case of it's what you make it?
I'm not a big fan of that term, right? That being said, I use it because I know my audience is used to that, and they know what I'm talking about. But if you are a minority, that implies a majority, which feeds into, bolsters at least, the oppressor-oppressed narrative, right? And that can do more harm than good, right? There are various other ways of saying, minority, and we should start saying those things more. That being said, if we don't change that term or retire that term, I won't lose sleep. I mean, at this point, it's just that people know what I'm talking about. for the sake of brevity, I would use it, right? And that's that.
Okay. Have you been involved in any specific initiatives or organizations within a uni or a college that aim to address issues of racism and promote diversity and inclusion?
I've been on diversity committees. I've chaired diversity committees. I've been a diversity officer. So in that sense, I've taken part in it. But it was never my academic or scholarly focus. I had it be part of my comprehensive exams in graduate school because, well, it would have been weird if I didn't, right? And I got that message loud and clear. But it really came out in administrative ways, right? And I've stepped away from it. I've given it up precisely because I want to focus on my scholarly interests, which, you know, if it does have to do with race, it's inadvertent. You know, it's not systemically about race. So I guess that's the answer. It's only been administrative, but I don't do that anymore, really.
Just looking at the parallels between our two nations, obviously we're currently here in the UK, you're from the States. You know, we've just had a new government voted in as of last night. It's currently elections taking place in America. You know, racism is not confined to one nation. We see it absolutely everywhere. So lots of parallels between many different nations. Just to step out of the context of higher education a little bit, just looking at it through a cultural lens, how much emphasis do you put on financial empowerment, almost delivering people of color from feeling or being in a position of vulnerability when it comes to racism, not just in the higher education context, in the corporate space, media and entertainment, excuse me, you know, whichever other field you can think of. You know, of course, it may not be enough to, you know, empower Black people to become rich so they can be viewed as equals. But how much emphasis would you say you put on that sort of closing the gap in terms of lived out experiences of ethnic people?
I put a lot of importance on it.
Okay.
Yes. Ian Rowe, as well as Rachel Ferguson and Mike Witcher, I believe, have written about the benefits of entrepreneurship when it comes to minorities, right? And what they can do to better their lives. Rowe also talks about religion, family, and things like that. But entrepreneurship is very important. I often bring up the story of a young woman, a young Black woman who started a very successful hair salon. You know, I think it was in her living room. I don't know where it was, but it was an upstart. She did it herself. She was making money, and government stepped in, right? Because, well, regulations, right? She didn't have the proper licensing. You know, she was as good as, if not better than the people who did, but she had to have that license. And to get that license, it takes some kind of schooling and things like that. So that kind of thing really bothers me, right? Certain things, I understand regulations to a degree. Other things, something like that, no, not at all. So I think it's very important that we, you know, emphasize entrepreneurship, just basic understandings of economics and finance. I think all that is important, and it's starting to happen, right? But we still have a long way to go.
We recently had an instance over here in this country. So our national team are over in Germany playing the Euro Cup. And prior to going to the tournament, we had like a couple friendly games and we didn't do too well. I think we lost both games. But it was a Black player who played, I believe, 25 minutes out of the 90, whose face was on, you know, all over the newspapers. And, you know, of course, the labels they attached to it were quite negative. Many people of influence spoke up and, addressed it from a standpoint of this has been going on and we're not going to stand for this anymore. People who have experienced racism have always been aware of the subtle microaggressions that exist within media and labeling and programming people to sort of view black people a certain way. Personal experience of mine, I could be walking on a street late at night and a Caucasian lady could be in front of me. And in fact, this has actually happened. She looked back, she felt scared and she ran, and I can only assume that comes from potentially programming and things like that. If you were in a position of power to make changes, especially towards media, what are some of the things that, well, firstly, let me ask, do you observe that there are certain things that happen in media that sort of enforce mindsets towards people of color? And if so, if you were in a position of power to make changes, what are some of the changes, if you could, make to those that govern our newspapers, our news outlets and platforms, etc.?
Well, my contribution has been to co-found a nonprofit called Free Black Thought. And the purpose of Free Black Thought is to showcase, inform people of the variety and diversity within the Black diaspora, right? And so we have a journal, Free Black Thought, where we give those people voices because they typically wouldn't get it in mainstream media. And the podcast and, obviously social media presence and things like that, to do our part in saying, hey, this is not, look at us as individuals, just like you look at yourselves as individuals, and go from there. Regarding the issue with the football player, I don't know very much about it, and I don't know how he did, or anything like that, or if there was a modicum of truth in what the papers were saying. But I think being cognizant of the history of representation of minorities or underrepresented groups, being knowledgeable of that can go a long way, right? Just have some self-reflection when you're writing about it, and make sure you're being fair. Yes, fair, but not. Watch your rhetoric.
Final question. You mentioned obviously representation and just some of the works that you do with those based in the diaspora. When some of these issues arise, obviously I've just mentioned the context of sport, where you have those who families are originally from like Africa, but the children that were born here will obviously represent nations like England, USA, so on and so forth. When some of these issues arise, especially in sports and media, etc., you have one sector of people that suggest, well, maybe the diaspora kids should look to become more connected to their roots and potentially represent their parent nations. And then some would argue, no, it's choice, and irrespective of if we'll never be seen as equal, we should never fear rejection, so et cetera, et cetera. How do you view it? Would you encourage diaspora kids to look more towards finding their roots, and if ever scenarios where they need to represent nations in certain fields arise, they should look more that way, or it's a case of, no, let everybody have their choice and whatever comes with that comes with that?
I'm more inclined to choose the latter.
Okay.
Let people have their choice, and what comes with that comes with that. I think it's great to get into your cultural, your roots, celebrate them, and if you so choose, abide by them and represent them, and embody them in some way. But if you don't want to do that, I think you should be allowed to not want to do that. I don't like the idea of people being compelled into a particular behavior, right? Even if I would prefer that they get back into their roots, I want to make sure they have that freedom of expression, right? Which is why I love the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution so much, because that's there for those people. A lot of I don't agree a lot with progressive politics, although I once called myself progressive. Things have changed a bit, right? But I agree when they say things like, let your freak flag fly, right? I like that. It's don't conform if you don't want to, right? Be who you want to be. I like that idea. So if you want to embrace your culture, excellent. If you don't, I hope you embrace something that is fulfilling and that can help yourself and ideally the world.
Yeah. Cool. Sorry, I know I said last question, but one more. Who stands to gain something from racial divide? Like, who are those that, would you say, benefit the most when cultures don't see eye to eye and there's that constant tension?
Politicians,
Okay.
to a large degree. In the States, I feel that the Democratic Party is the one that uses prescription as their form of racism the most, and it's also the party that is more negative when it comes to black prospects. Biden, in a speech to Morehouse, I believe, during their graduation, just talked about how bad the world was for black people, right? Why do you do that? So that they say, it is bad. We got to vote for this guy. Yeah. He's going to save us, So sadly, that party has been banking on that for some time. It's starting to change, though. There are a lot of black people who are moving further right. Black people who are part of the Make America Great Again movement, right? But of course, they're not. They're called inauthentically black or multiracially white or worse, right? But I think that the benefit is dividing people and getting all these people on your side and none of them on the other side, right? So yeah, another group of people it benefits are, and sad to say this, but people in the EDI industry, right? People who do the workshops, throughout the year, people who do implicit bias training and things like that. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. If racism went away, they have to do something else now. Yeah. So it encourages finding things that are racist, which is why one of the tenets of critical social justice or anti-racist education from Robin DiAngelo, one of the tenets is the question isn't did racism happen, but how did it manifest in this situation? That's a very dangerous statement, but it's quite beneficial to the kinds of people who say it, right? Because it puts food on the table.
Erec, can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.